The morning of August 9th, 1944, near the village of Mortain in Normandy, France, Oberleutnant Karl Weber crouched in the turret of his Panther tank, listening to a sound that had become more terrifying than artillery fire. The distinctive rumble of radial engines, American engines. His crew had learned to recognize them instantly, deep, powerful, unmistakable. The Thunderbolts were coming. Weber's Panther was one of the most advanced armored vehicles in the world, sloped frontal armor 70 millimeters thick that could deflect most Allied shells, a 75 millimeter main gun capable of destroying a Sherman tank at 2,000 meters, superior optics, excellent mobility. In a ground engagement, Weber's crew knew they could defeat almost any Allied armor they faced. But when the Jabos came, none of that mattered. Jabo. The word had become synonymous with death from above, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. It was the term German soldiers used for the Allied aircraft that ruled the skies over France. When men heard that sound, the deep thunder of American radial engines growing louder, they knew what was coming. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 5-inch rockets, 500-pound bombs, and there was almost nothing they could do to stop it. Weber ordered his driver to pull the Panther under the trees. Engine off, no movement. The crew sat in silence, waiting. Through the open hatch, Weber could see them now. 4 P-47 Thunderbolts flying low over the hedgerows, searching, hunting. The lead aircraft banked slightly, and Weber's stomach tightened. Had they been spotted? The Thunderbolts circled once, then dove toward a German supply column, half a kilometer away. The hammer of machine guns echoed across the fields, followed by explosions. Black smoke rose into the morning sky. Weber exhaled slowly. Not this time. But it was only a matter of hours before the Thunderbolts would return. They always did. This was the reality of warfare in Normandy in the summer of 1944. German armored forces, despite their superior tanks and experienced crews, had been reduced to hiding during daylight hours, moving only at night or in heavy fog, praying for clouds that would ground the Allied aircraft. The hunter had become the hunted. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But here is the question that has puzzled military historians for decades. Why did German forces speak with such terror about American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons, while other Allied fighters, the legendary Supermarine Spitfire and the Soviet Yakovlev Yak-9, generated far less fear among tank crews? Were the Thunderbolt and Typhoon simply better tank killers? Was there something about their design, their weapons, their tactics that made them more deadly, or was the answer more complex, involving factors that had nothing to do with the aircraft themselves? The answer reveals a fundamental truth about modern warfare that German tank crews learned through bitter experience in the summer of 1944. It was not the aircraft that mattered most. It was what the aircraft represented. To understand why, we must first examine what these aircraft actually were, how they were used, and what they could realistically accomplish against armored targets. Because the truth, documented in post-war investigations and declassified records, is far more nuanced than the legends suggest. And it begins with understanding what the P-47 Thunderbolt was designed to do, and what it actually did when it arrived over the battlefields of France. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not originally designed as a ground attack aircraft. It was conceived in 1939 as a high-altitude interceptor built around the most powerful radial engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder air-cooled power plant produced 2,000 horsepower, driving a 4-bladed propeller 13 feet in diameter. The result was an aircraft that weighed 17,500 pounds when fully loaded, approximately 8 tons, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of World War II. That weight came from deliberate design choices. The airframe was constructed with heavy structural members and thick aluminum skin. Armor plating protected the pilot from the front and rear. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning bullet holes would automatically seal to prevent catastrophic fuel loss. The radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines used in most fighters, could lose several cylinders to battle damage and continue operating. Every element of the Thunderbolt's design prioritized survivability. The aircraft's primary armament consisted of 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. Each gun was loaded with between 300 and 425 rounds, giving the aircraft a total ammunition load of approximately 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, the Thunderbolt delivered a weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate light armor, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy soft-skinned vehicles. Beyond its machine guns, the P-47 could carry external ordnance on hardpoints under the fuselage and wings. A typical combat load consisted of 2 500-pound bombs, 1 under each wing, or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. These weapons gave the Thunderbolt considerable firepower against ground targets, but they also raised an important question. How effective were these weapons actually against German armor? The answer, according to post-war investigations conducted by both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, was sobering. During the entire Normandy campaign from June 6 to August 21, 1944, German forces lost approximately 100 tanks to Allied air attacks. Only 100 out of thousands of tanks committed to the battle. Aircraft destroyed far more trucks, artillery pieces, and soft-skinned vehicles. But actual tank kills from air attacks were remarkably low. A British operational research study conducted after the Battle of the Falaise Pocket examined the wreckage of German vehicles in detail. The investigation found that claims by Allied pilots vastly exceeded actual destructions. Pilots attacking the same target often each claimed it as destroyed. Gun camera footage from low-altitude attacks was frequently unclear. Disabled vehicles were sometimes counted as destroyed when they might have been repairable. And pilots, like all combatants, under stressful combat conditions, tended to assess damage optimistically. The 50 caliber machine guns that armed the P-47, while devastating against aircraft and unarmored vehicles, had difficulty penetrating even the thin top armor of German tanks. Tank roofs were typically armored with 10 to 30 millimeters of steel plate, angled to deflect fire from above. Machine gun rounds occasionally penetrated through vision ports, hatches, or engine grills, and ricochets could cause casualties inside the vehicle. But direct penetration of armor plate was rare. The 5-inch rockets carried by P-47s were more powerful, but also far less accurate. British tests, conducted under ideal conditions, with experienced pilots attacking stationary tank targets on a firing range, found that rockets achieved only a 4.69% hit rate, 4.69% under perfect circumstances. In actual combat, with camouflaged tanks, anti-aircraft fire, and crews taking evasive action, accuracy was even lower. Post-war analysis concluded that it took approximately 800 rockets to achieve one hit on a tank-sized target in battle conditions. Bombs were the most powerful weapons, capable of destroying any tank with a direct hit or near miss, but bombs were also the least accurate. It was calculated that approximately 3,500 bombs were required to hit a single tank under combat conditions. The reality of aerial tank killing in World War II was that it was extraordinarily difficult, even with overwhelming air superiority and constant attacks. So, if the weapons were not particularly effective against tanks, why did German forces fear the P-47 Thunderbolt so intensely? Why did soldiers throughout Normandy coin the term Jabos, death by fighter bomber, and consider it the most feared way to die in the campaign? The answer lies not in what the Thunderbolts destroyed directly, but in what they represented and what they prevented. The tactical problem facing German armored forces in Normandy was unprecedented in modern warfare. Since June 6th, D-Day, Allied aircraft had attacked German formations with relentless intensity. American P-47s with their 850 caliber machine guns and bombs, British Typhoons armed with 20mm cannons and rockets. The attacks came in waves throughout daylight hours, particularly during clear weather, turning roads into killing zones and forcing German units to move only at night or in heavy fog. Official Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early July 1944 documented that Allied fighter bombers were conducting between 2,000 and 3,000 sorties per day over the Normandy battlefield, 2,000 to 3,000 attacks every single day. German formations attempting to move to the front during daylight hours were losing 10 to 15% of their vehicles before reaching their designated assembly areas. Tank columns reported being attacked every 20 to 30 minutes when weather permitted flight operations. The operational impact was devastating. German armored divisions that should have been able to cover 50 to 80 kilometers per day were reduced to moving only at night, covering perhaps 20 kilometers before dawn forced them back into concealment. Units dispersed into small groups and hid in woods or villages during daylight hours. Camouflage netting became more important than ammunition. Commanders planned movements around weather forecasts, praying for clouds and rain that would ground Allied aircraft. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, perhaps Germany's most respected armored warfare commander, understood this problem from the earliest days of the Normandy campaign. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, Rommel sent a frank assessment to his superiors at Wehrmacht High Command. The message was clear and unambiguous. The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There is simply no answer to it. Every movement of our troops by day is subject to air attack from fighter bombers. The enemy has complete command of the air over the battle area up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Rommel's assessment was not pessimism or defeatism. It was accurate tactical analysis from Germany's most experienced field commander. He had fought against Allied air power in North Africa. He knew what air superiority meant for ground operations. And he knew that without control of the air, German armored forces could not execute the kind of mobile warfare that had brought them victory in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. 2 months later, on July 17, 1944, Rommel himself became a casualty of Allied air supremacy. He was returning from an inspection tour of the front lines when his staff car was spotted by British Spitfires from 6-2 Squadron, Royal Air Force. The Spitfires dove and strafed the vehicle on a road near St. Fouad, Montgomery. Machine gun fire struck the car and the road surface, causing the driver to lose control. The vehicle crashed. Rommel, who was not wearing a safety belt, was thrown from the car onto the road. He suffered 3 skull fractures, a fractured left temple and cheekbone, and damage to his left eye. Rommel never returned to Normandy. He spent weeks recovering in a German hospital. In October 1944, after being implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, he was forced to commit suicide by taking cyanide. The official Nazi government announcement claimed he had died from his injuries. But Allied air power had effectively removed Germany's most capable field commander from the Normandy battlefield months before his death. Rommel was not the only German general officer killed or wounded by Allied aircraft during the Normandy campaign. Between June 6th and June 18th, 1944, 3 German division commanders died in air attacks, a casualty rate among senior leadership that was unprecedented in modern warfare. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, one of the most experienced defensive specialists in the Wehrmacht, was killed by fighter-bomber attack on June 12, 1944, just 6 days into the campaign. He had been instrumental in organizing the initial German response to the invasion. General Wilhelm Fally, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, was killed on D-Day itself. General Heinz Hellmich, commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, died in an air attack on June 17, 1944. His division had been attempting to move toward the front when Allied aircraft struck the column. General Rudolf Stegmann, commanding the 77th Infantry Division, was killed by strafing aircraft on June 18, 1944, as his unit attempted to reinforce defensive positions near the invasion beaches. These were not chance casualties from random encounters. They were the result of systematic Allied air operations designed to paralyze German command and control. Fighter bombers hunted for staff cars, command vehicles, and radio antennas that indicated headquarters locations. The psychological effect on surviving German commanders was profound. They knew that movement during daylight hours invited death from above, regardless of rank or position. Death at the hands of Allied fighter bombers had become so common among German forces that soldiers created their own grim terminology. Jabotod, death by Jabot. It was a fate that generals and privates shared equally. Rank provided no protection from 50 caliber machine guns firing from a diving Thunderbolt. Now, here is where the story becomes more complex. Because the term Jabo and the fear it represented was not specific to the P-47 Thunderbolt. Jabo was a German abbreviation for Jagdbomber, meaning fighter bomber. German soldiers used this term for all Allied fighter bombers that attacked them. American P-47s, British Typhoons, even P-51s when they carried bombs. The fear was not of one specific aircraft. It was fear of Allied air supremacy itself. But within that general fear, patterns emerged. German tank crews and infantry soldiers did distinguish between different Allied aircraft, and they developed strong opinions about which ones posed the greatest threat. And those opinions, documented in captured German documents, post-war interrogations, and memoirs written by German veterans, reveal surprising details about what actually terrified them most. The British Hawker Typhoon was, by multiple accounts, considered the most feared aircraft by German tank commanders, not the P-47. The Typhoon. This single-engine fighter-bomber was powered by a Napier Sabre engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, giving it exceptional speed at low altitude. It was armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons and could carry either 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 RP-3 rockets, British 60-pound rocket projectiles that were larger and more powerful than the American 5-inch rockets. The Typhoon's rockets, while no more accurate than American rockets, carried heavier warheads and generated distinctive visual and sound signatures that German soldiers found particularly terrifying. The aircraft itself made a distinctive sound when diving to attack, caused by air moving through the rocket rails at high speed. Panzer crews often abandoned their vehicles once they heard that sound approaching. The psychological impact of the Typhoon's rocket attacks was profound, even though post-war analysis showed the actual destruction rate was similar to other fighter bombers. German accounts from Normandy frequently mention both Typhoons and P-47s in the same breath as equally feared opponents. A Wehrmacht divisional history from the Panzer Lehr Division noted that the constant Jabo presence from American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons made movement during daylight suicidal. Another account from a tank commander in the 21st Panzer Division stated that we feared the Typhoons and the Thunderbolts equally. When either appeared, we could only take cover and pray. So, if both the Typhoon and the P-47 generated intense fear, what about the other Allied fighters? Why did the Supermarine Spitfire, perhaps the most famous Allied fighter of the war, not generate the same level of terror among German ground forces? The answer is simple. The Spitfire was rarely used for ground attack missions, and when it was, it performed poorly in that role. The Spitfire was designed as an interceptor, optimized for air-to-air combat. Its elliptical wings, while beautiful and aerodynamically efficient for dogfighting, were thin and lightly built. They could not carry heavy external loads. A Spitfire could carry one 500-pound bomb on a centerline rack and two 250-pound bombs under the wings. But this was significantly less than the P-47 or Typhoon could carry. More critically, the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was liquid-cooled, with radiators and coolant lines running through the airframe. A single hit from ground fire that pierced the coolant system would cause the engine to overheat and seize within minutes. At the low altitudes required for ground attack, where aircraft flew directly into the range of German light, anti-aircraft guns, and even small arms fire, liquid-cooled engines were extremely vulnerable. Royal Air Force records from June 1944 show that, of 152 Spitfires destroyed or damaged from all causes that month, light flak, anti-aircraft fire up to 30 millimeters, claimed the majority of aircraft lost while operating as fighter bombers. The Spitfire's light construction and vulnerable cooling system made it poorly suited for the ground attack role. British commanders recognized this and generally assigned Spitfires to air superiority, reconnaissance, and high-altitude missions, roles for which the aircraft excelled. The few Spitfire units that did conduct ground attack missions suffered high casualties and achieved limited results against armored targets. A British Tactical Air Force report from August 1944 noted that Spitfire squadrons assigned to ground attack were taking heavier losses than Typhoon squadrons conducting the same missions, while achieving fewer confirmed destructions. The Spitfire was a superb air superiority fighter, but it was not a tank buster, and it was not used extensively in that role. German tank crews, therefore, had limited exposure to Spitfire ground attacks. They saw Spitfires occasionally, usually at higher altitudes or in air-to-air combat roles. But the aircraft that actually attacked their convoys, their positions, their supply columns day after day were predominantly P-47s and Typhoons. These were the aircraft that generated the psychological association with helplessness and death from above. And what about the Soviet Yakovlev Yak-9, the fighter that the title of this story suggests German forces did not fear? This is where the question itself reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the air war in World War II. Because German forces on the Eastern Front absolutely did fear Soviet fighter bombers. They feared them intensely. But the circumstances under which they encountered them were radically different from the conditions in Normandy. The Yakovlev Yak-9 was one of the most successful Soviet fighters of World War II, with over 16,000 built between 1942 and 1948. It was a versatile aircraft, lighter than the P-47 or Typhoon, weighing approximately 2,900 kilograms at takeoff. The Yak-9 was powered by a Klimov VK-105 liquid-cooled V12 engine, producing approximately 1,200 horsepower, giving it excellent speed and maneuverability at low to medium altitudes. The basic Yak-9 was armed with one 20mm Schwack cannon firing through the propeller hub and one 12.7mm UBS machine gun. But the aircraft was produced in numerous variants designed for different roles. The Yak-9T carried a 37mm NS-37 cannon specifically for anti-tank and anti-aircraft use. The Yak-9K featured an even larger 45mm cannon. The Yak-9B was a fighter-bomber variant with an internal bomb bay behind the cockpit that could carry up to 400 kilograms of bombs. These specialized variants gave the Yak-9 significant anti-armor capabilities. The 37mm cannon-firing armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the thin top armor of German tanks under ideal conditions. Soviet pilots were trained to attack tanks from the rear or sides, where armor was thinnest, diving at steep angles to maximize penetration. The French volunteer squadron, Normandy Niemen, which flew Yak-3 fighters on the Eastern Front, achieved notable success using these tactics. So, the Yak-9 was certainly capable of ground attack missions, and German forces on the Eastern Front encountered Soviet fighter bombers regularly. But the tactical situation on the Eastern Front differed dramatically from the conditions in Normandy in ways that fundamentally changed the nature of air-ground warfare. First, the scale of operations was vastly different. The Eastern Front stretched for thousands of kilometers, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Soviet and German forces fought across enormous expanses of territory in battles involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of armored vehicles. The concentration of aircraft per square kilometer was significantly lower than in Normandy, where Allied forces in Normandy could field one aircraft for every square kilometer of battlefield. Soviet forces on the Eastern Front might have one aircraft for every 20 or 30 square kilometers. Second, and more importantly, the Luftwaffe remained a significant fighting force on the Eastern Front throughout 1944. German fighter units contested Soviet air superiority. Soviet bombers and ground attack aircraft operated under constant threat of interception by Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf W-190 fighters. The Luftwaffe had been largely driven from the skies over Normandy by June 1944, but it continued flying combat operations over Russia until the end of the war. This meant that Soviet aircraft could not operate with the same impunity that Allied aircraft enjoyed over France. Soviet ground attack missions required fighter escort. Attacks had to be carefully coordinated. Pilots faced significant risk from both German fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. The relentless, around-the-clock presence that characterized Allied air operations in Normandy was not replicated on the Eastern Front. Third, the primary Soviet ground attack aircraft was not the Yak-9, but the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. This heavily armored, purpose-built ground attack aircraft was specifically designed to survive enemy fire while attacking ground targets. It carried armor plating around the cockpit and engine, two 23mm or 37mm cannons, rockets, and bombs. Soviet forces produced over 36,000 Il-2 aircraft during the war, more than any other military aircraft in history. The Sturmovik was the aircraft that German ground forces on the Eastern Front feared most. Wehrmacht soldiers called it the Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. Tank crews learned to recognize its distinctive profile and the sound of its engines. When Sturmoviks appeared, German forces took cover, just as they did when Thunderbolts appeared over Normandy. The psychological impact was similar. The aircraft represented Soviet air power and the threat of attack from above. But even on the Eastern Front, with dedicated ground attack aircraft like the Sturmovik, actual tank kills from air attacks remained relatively low. Soviet after-action reports from the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, one of the largest tank battles in history, show that of 648 tanks lost by the Soviet First Tank Army, only 11 were destroyed by German aircraft. Aircraft were responsible for approximately 2% of tank losses, even in a battle where thousands of aircraft participated. The pattern was consistent across all theaters. At Kursk, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, wherever large armored forces clashed, air attacks accounted for only 2 to 7% of actual tank losses. The vast majority of tanks were destroyed by other tanks, by anti-tank guns, or were abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Aircraft were far more effective at destroying trucks, artillery, supply depots, and command posts than they were at killing tanks directly. So why then did German forces fear air attacks so intensely if the actual destruction rate was so low? This is the critical question, and the answer reveals what really mattered in the air-ground battle of World War II. The fear was not about the tanks that were destroyed. It was about everything else the aircraft prevented German forces from doing. When Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies over Normandy, German armored divisions could not move during daylight. They could not concentrate forces for counterattacks. They could not bring forward supplies, fuel, and ammunition. They could not evacuate wounded soldiers. They could not reposition artillery. They could not conduct reconnaissance. They could not communicate effectively because radio transmissions attracted air attacks on headquarters locations. The presence of Allied aircraft flying continuously throughout daylight hours paralyzed German mobile operations. It did not matter whether the aircraft actually destroyed tanks. What mattered was that German commanders knew that any movement, any concentration, any attempt to maneuver would immediately attract air attacks, and those attacks would destroy trucks carrying fuel, kill soldiers marching to the front, cut telephone lines, destroy bridges, and generally make coordinated military operations impossible. This was the strategic impact of air supremacy. It was not measured in tank kills. It was measured in the complete inability of German forces to conduct mobile warfare. And mobile warfare, the rapid movement and concentration of armored forces at decisive points, was the foundation of German military doctrine. Without the ability to maneuver, German tactical and operational advantages were negated. A German tank commander from the 5th Panzer Army, interviewed after the war, explained it clearly. "We did not fear the Jabos because it would destroy our tank. Our Panther could survive most attacks. We feared the Jabos because when it appeared, we could not fight. We could not move. We could only hide, and an army that hides cannot win battles." This psychological dimension, the feeling of helplessness in the face of an enemy you cannot engage effectively, was what made the term Jabotod so powerful. German soldiers were trained to fight. They were confident in their weapons, their tactics, their ability to close with the enemy and destroy him. But against aircraft attacking from above, there was no meaningful response. You could shoot at them with machine guns and hope to get lucky. You could deploy anti-aircraft guns and force them to attack from higher altitudes. But you could not make them go away. You could not Win? And this brings us to the fundamental answer to the question posed by this story. Why did German forces fear American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons, but not Spitfires or Soviet Yaks? The answer is not that the Thunderbolt and Typhoon were superior tank killers. The answer is the German forces encountered Thunderbolts and Typhoons under conditions of complete Allied air supremacy in a concentrated theater of operations, while their encounters with Spitfires and Yaks occurred under entirely different circumstances. In Normandy, Allied air supremacy was absolute. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. German fighters rarely appeared over the battlefield. Allied fighter bombers operated with near impunity. The weather was generally favorable for flying. The battlefield was geographically concentrated, and the Allies could dedicate enormous numbers of aircraft to ground attack missions in a relatively small area. Under these conditions, P-47s and Typhoons, the primary fighter bombers assigned to ground attack roles, became the visible symbols of Allied air power and the helplessness German forces felt beneath it. Spitfires were rarely used for ground attack in Normandy because they were poorly suited to the role. When they were used, they suffered heavy casualties. German tank crews did not fear Spitfires because they rarely saw Spitfires attacking them. It was not that the Spitfire was less capable in some absolute sense. It was that British commanders, recognizing the aircraft's limitations for ground attack, generally assigned it to other missions. Soviet Yaks operated on the Eastern Front under contested air superiority across a vastly larger geographic area, in a theater where the Luftwaffe remained active throughout the war. German forces on the Eastern Front feared Soviet air attacks, particularly from Sturmovix. But the nature of the threat was different. Soviet aircraft could not achieve the same continuous presence over the battlefield that Allied aircraft achieved in Normandy. The psychological impact, while significant, was not the same overwhelming sense of helplessness that characterized the German experience in France. The lesson that German tank crews learned in Normandy in the summer of 1944 was about the dominance of air power in modern military operations. Armies that lose control of the air cannot sustain mobile operations. They cannot maneuver. They cannot concentrate forces. They cannot maintain supply lines. And without these capabilities, even superior equipment and tactics become irrelevant. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment of the Normandy campaign in post-war interrogations. When asked what factors defeated German forces in France, he replied clearly, 3 factors defeated us in the West, where I was in command. First, the unheard-of superiority of your Air Force, which made all movement in daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel. And third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. This made impossible the bringing up of reserves, and it was foolish to attempt military operations in France under such conditions. Von Rundstedt's assessment, from one of Germany's most senior and experienced commanders, confirmed what Hans von Luck, Erwin Rommel, and thousands of other German soldiers had experienced firsthand. Allied air superiority, manifested through aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Hawker Typhoon, was the decisive factor that defeated German forces in Normandy. Everything else, the numerical superiority of Allied ground forces, the quality of Allied equipment, the skill of Allied commanders, built upon the foundation of air dominance. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat missions in Europe in May 1945, as German forces surrendered. By that time, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other American fighter aircraft except the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft had served in every theater where American forces fought, from Western Europe to Italy to the Pacific. Official Army Air Force statistical reports credited P-47 pilots with extraordinary achievements from D-Day through VE Day. The record showed 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives knocked out, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles claimed, and 68,000 trucks destroyed. These were the official claims submitted by pilots and verified through gun camera footage and mission reports. Post-war historical analysis suggested that these numbers were significantly inflated due to multiple factors. Pilots attacking the same target often each claimed it as destroyed. Gun camera footage in the chaos of low-altitude attacks was frequently unclear. Disabled vehicles were sometimes counted as destroyed when they might have been repairable. And pilots, like all combatants, tended to assess as damage optimistically under stressful combat conditions. Modern historians estimate that actual destructions were perhaps 40 to 60% of the claim totals. Even if the numbers are reduced by half, the impact on German logistics and mobility was devastating. Thousands of vehicles actually were destroyed. Hundreds of trains were wrecked. German units throughout France reported severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies because Allied air attacks had destroyed so much of the transportation infrastructure. The fundamental lesson from the Thunderbolts' combat record in Normandy was about combined arms warfare and the dominance of air power in modern military operations. German armored forces, despite having superior tanks in many respects, superior training in armored tactics, and years of combat experience, could not operate effectively under enemy air supremacy. The Panther tank had better armor protection and a more powerful main gun than the Sherman. The Tiger tank could destroy Allied armor at ranges where Allied tanks could not penetrate its frontal armor. German tank crews had more training hours and more combat experience than their American opponents. By conventional measures of equipment quality and crew proficiency, German armored forces in Normandy should have been able to contain the Allied invasion. But when Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies above Normandy, none of those advantages mattered. German armor could not move during daylight without inviting destruction. Units that attempted to maneuver were attacked repeatedly until they stopped or were annihilated. The ability to maneuver, which is the essence of armored warfare, was taken away from German tank units by Allied air power. The term Jabos captured perfectly the psychological impact of this new reality on German soldiers. It was death that came from above, death against which ground forces had limited means of defense, death that could strike at any moment when weather permitted flight operations. German soldiers throughout the Normandy campaign feared the Jabos more than they feared Allied tanks, more than they feared artillery, more than any other weapon or threat they faced. The sound of American radial engines, the deep rumble of P-47 Thunderbolts approaching at low altitude, became psychologically associated with helplessness and fear. The whistle of diving aircraft signaled the beginning of an attack. The hammer of 8 50-caliber machine guns meant rounds were impacting nearby, tearing through vehicles and bodies with equal ease. These sounds became triggers for immediate stress responses, even in veteran soldiers who had fought bravely in ground combat for years. That psychological dominance, combined with the physical disruption caused by repeated attacks day after day, broke the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct mobile operations in France. German armor, which had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1942 through speed, flexibility, and concentration of force, was reduced to hiding in woods during daylight and moving only under cover of darkness. The hunter had become the hunted. The dominant weapon system of the early war years had been made obsolete by a newer technology operating in a different dimension. This transformation in the nature of warfare, more than any single battle or tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Allied forces won not just because they had more troops, though they did, not just because they had better logistics, and though Allied supply systems were far superior to German capabilities. They won primarily because their aircraft controlled the sky over the battlefield, and that control made it impossible for German forces to maneuver effectively, to concentrate for counterattacks, or to sustain defensive operations over time. The legacy of the air campaign in Normandy extends far beyond World War II. The lessons learned in that campaign shaped military doctrine for decades, Every major military force in the world reorganized after 1945 to emphasize air power and combined arms operations. The United States Air Force became an independent service branch, separated from the Army, recognizing that air power was a distinct form of warfare requiring specialized organization and doctrine. Other nations followed similar paths, building powerful air forces and developing equipment and tactics for both offensive and defensive air operations. The close air support techniques pioneered in Normandy became standard practice. Forward air controllers, improved radio communications, better coordination between ground and air forces. These innovations from 1944 formed the basis for close air support operations in every subsequent conflict. The sight of aircraft attacking enemy ground forces, which German soldiers in Normandy experienced as devastating and unstoppable, became a routine expectation for Allied ground forces in later wars. The fundamental lesson the German tank crews learned in Normandy has been relearned in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Ukraine. Control of the air means control of the battlefield. Ground forces operating without friendly air cover or effective air defenses face destruction from above. There is no tactical solution, no clever defensive positioning, no superior equipment that can fully negate the threat from aircraft attacking with impunity. But the story is more nuanced than simple technological determinism suggests. It was not that the P-47 Thunderbolt was inherently more fearsome than other fighters. It was not that American or British pilots were more skilled than Soviet pilots. It was not even that Western fighter bombers were dramatically more effective at destroying tanks than their counterparts on the Eastern Front. What made German forces fear the Thunderbolt and the Typhoon so intensely was the combination of factors that came together in Normandy in the summer of 1944. Complete air supremacy, concentrated geographic area, favorable weather, overwhelming numbers of aircraft, sophisticated coordination systems, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological reality of facing an enemy against whom there was no effective response. When Oberleutnant Karl Weber crouched in his Panther tank near Mortain, listening to the sound of approaching Thunderbolts, he was not afraid because the Thunderbolt was a superior tank killer in some technical sense. He was afraid because that sound represented everything his training and experience had taught him was necessary for victory in mobile warfare and which Allied air supremacy had taken away: the ability to move, the ability to maneuver, the ability to concentrate force at decisive points, the ability to fight on terms where German advantages in equipment and training mattered. The Jabos had stripped all of that away, and that was why German soldiers feared it more than any other weapon they faced. Not because of what it destroyed directly, but because of everything it prevented them from doing. The Jabos did not have to kill your tank to defeat you. It only had to appear in the sky above you day after day, hour after hour, forcing you to hide, to wait, to surrender the initiative to your enemy. That was the true power of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the skies over Normandy. And that was the lesson that transformed modern warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.